Hello and welcome to POLYCOSM. My name's Christina and today we'll be going through the process of creating very basic forms using the skin modifier technique, using that base to sculpt our cute little critter Xerocole, creating a mirrored instance of each body part and parenting them together, and then finally posing Xerocole before we go into the final detail stage. So starting off, I thought I'd show you guys how exactly I created the super primitive forms. This is just one of many ways of creating base meshes in Blender, but I really like this method. So in order for the skin modifier to work, we need a vertex to work with. So to create that vertex, you just Shift A, add in either a plane or a cube. I'm gonna add in a plane. Go into edit mode, and then since everything's selected, you press M, merge at center, and you'll have a vertex here. It's very difficult to see, but yeah, you have a single vertex here. And then from here, you go into the modifier tab, add in a skin modifier, and there we go. In order to get more of a spherical look, you add a subdivision surface that goes on the bottom here. And from here, you can add more subdivisions. And once you're in edit mode, you can start extruding. So you just press E on your keyboard and it will start extruding. So E again, E again. And from here, if you press Alt-Z, you get an X-ray kind of view and you can see all the different vertices that makes up this shape. So if you choose one and press Ctrl-A, you can start scaling this. So you can see how this is very useful in creating organic forms very easily. So if we just kind of create a form here, and maybe we want to extrude from here, so we press E. I recommend scaling this down so the geometry doesn't freak out completely. And you can also scale in a different axis. So if you choose a vertex and you press Ctrl-A, it'll start scaling. But if you then press X, it'll scale in the X-axis. And if you press Y, it'll scale in the Y-axis. So this little circle means that this is the root. So if we delete this, we lose all of the geometry. So if we go back and say we really wanted to delete this point, but we don't want to mess up any of the other points, we can choose a new root. So you just highlight a new one, go over here in the modifier panel and press mark root, and you can see the circle shifted over here. So now we can delete this vertex. If you want to create a vertex in between two vertices, you just highlight two and then right click and press subdivide, and there we go. And you can continue extruding from here. Now that I've shown you the method I use to create the primitive shapes, let's speed up that part. I used the references based on Omercan's sketches from the last video. I actually noticed the heads weren't properly aligned, and I also noticed the legs being posed differently, so I just chose to mainly stick with the side view. Because the feet look different in the orthographic views and the perspective view, I asked Omercan to clarify the structure of the leg, and because of the skin modifier technique, this was easily adjustable. I cannot stress this enough. Always start with super primitive shapes, because if you start detailing or adding too much geometry too early, this just makes it much harder to edit later on, and trust me, you'll hate yourself if you notice an error further down the road and you've jumped the gun too quickly. This is a common beginner mistake, so just take your time and almost make it a challenge to stay low poly for as long as you can. At this point, I asked Omercan to come in and just kind of make sure that I had all of the forms correctly, because he's the one who designed Xerocole, so I just wanted to make sure that he kind of could give me final approval. And once I got the final approval, I just started subdividing all the shapes a bit more, getting a bit more geometry in there. And then I just applied all of those modifiers so I could start sculpting. So here's a handy little trick, instances. You probably know that if you press Shift D, you'll create a copy, but if you press Alt D, you'll create an instance. And what an instance is basically a copy of a mesh, but it'll keep all of the information and deformation of the original model. Since I want you guys to learn from my mistakes, I did something a bit stupid. Basically, I wanted to create instances of the legs and arms and mirror them over, because when I start sculpting, it would copy all of that information over to the other side, and that way I could pose all of the different parts separately and create an asymmetrical pose. But what I forgot to do is apply all of the modifiers before doing this. And once you have an instance, you can't apply a subdivision modifier, for example. It literally won't allow you. So I went through the process of creating instances and then parenting them together, only to find out, well, shit, I can't sculpt on this because I can't apply the subdivision modifiers. So I had to get rid of the instances, kind of delete them and just like unparent everything and just merge the subdivision modifiers before doing anything else. Just learn from my mistakes, don't be stupid like me. Anyway, despite my little mistake, I continued onwards with the sculpting and started blocking in the bony landmarks, thinking about the skeletal structure underneath and how the muscles would wrap around on our creature. The main sculpting brushes I used was clay buildup, the crease brush, the Snakehook brush, and the smooth brush. Nothing too fancy in the beginning stages. Clay buildup is a really nice brush that allows you to build up forms quickly and organically. The crease tool was used for distinguishing important forms, plane changes, and making mental notes for future reference, for example where muscles would be placed. The Snakehook tool is a really good tool to use for moving geometry and extruding areas. There is a move brush that you can use, but that one basically just stretches surfaces. So if you stretch a surface too far, the surface can get a bit ugly as there aren't enough faces to cover that area. So what I recommend instead is to use the Snakehook brush, but turn Dyntopo, which means dynamic topology, under the brushes panel on. That way it will extrude and pull out areas, but add more geometry at the same time. And of course, a smooth brush is just a way of smoothing surfaces. Because Xerocole is a mix of a few animals, I had to look up tons of anatomy references on foxes, rats, jerboas, basically similar creatures. The thing with anatomy is, and this applies to every animal, is you'll find the same type of muscles, but they'll be structured a bit differently depending on if the animal, for example, needs to be fast and explosive, or if it's an animal that climbs a lot, and so on. So even though I couldn't find a direct source, I gathered a bunch of different animal anatomy references and tried to combine them. Now I know what you're thinking. Why would you sculpt all of the muscles if you're just gonna cover it up with fur anyway? I could of course have jumped into the first stage as soon as possible, but I wanted to make this an animal study almost and go the extra mile because I knew that that knowledge is really going to pay off later. Yes, it took me much longer to get the Basemesh done, but holy crap did I learn a lot from doing it the hard way. So I honestly recommend going down the more difficult and time-consuming route because that extra effort will pay off. It's kind of like just tracing an object or anatomy or whatever, instead of actually sitting down and studying the forms, how it's constructed and works in three-dimensional space. If you're a beginner, you should start conditioning yourself early on, because if you choose to cheat a lot, you're actually just cheating yourself out of knowledge, and that lack of fundamentals will come back and bite you in the arse. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience. So I'm going to be jumping ahead a bit because I don't want to show you the entire process because that would just be very boring. So instead I'm going to kind of slow it down in some parts and kind of talk over. So here I was working on the head and had a really hard time because I know that since I'm so new to sculpting, working in a new medium was very challenging to me. I really enjoy working with three-dimensional forms, but I quickly found out how lacking my anatomical knowledge actually was, especially when it comes to animal heads. So the best thing I could do here is just gather lots and lots and lots of references and try to kind of figure out the structure of the skull and how the muscles would sit on top. And even though it took me a long time to kind of figure all of this out, I actually learned so much through this process. I really recommend just kind of sticking it out, finding good reference and just trying this over and over again until you like fully understand it. So skipping ahead a bit more, this was day 2 of sculpting Xerocole. I really needed a break because, you know, when you're learning a new craft, you just get very fatigued. Your brain is taking in so much new information. And in my second day, I wanted to really focus on the shoulder areas and get the anatomy right there. So I added in lots of new references, rat references, fox references. I actually found this rabbit sculpt on Sketchfab that helped me so much because it was a super dynamic sculpt, but it was a very good reference for muscles. And I actually asked Omercan at some points to use the sketch over tool, Annotation I think it's called in Blender, to just kind of sketch over some of the forms because I was really struggling to kind of connect things in my brain, and he's much better at anatomy than I am. So he kind of sketched over, I saved at that camera view, and then I tried to kind of sculpt to match that. That was very helpful. I highly recommend using the Annotation tool or the Grease pencil tool and just kind of sketch over when you're a bit unsure of things. Here I'm using the Crease tool in the way I mentioned before, just kind of sketching out mental notes, figure out the placement of the muscle on top of the form, and trying to really analyze the forms, the muscles in the rabbit sculpt to my left. At this stage, I had most of the forms down, so I used Jayanam's add-on called JSculpt, which allows you to merge 2 separate objects together in order to sculpt on them both, and this operation is called Bool Union. It's a free add-on and really speeds up the process of sculpting. You can do this manually in Blender, but you'll have to like sift through several different menus, so I highly recommend just installing the add-on instead. Here, Omercan helped me out again with the back leg because, again, I was really struggling with like figuring out how everything was connected. So he just quickly sketched over everything. And then I tried to match it up in sculpt mode. So the final thing I wanted to show you guys before jumping into the posing and final presentation of Xerocole is how to parent objects and how to add simple bones to a mesh in order to deform it. So if you select an object, for example this thigh, you'll see that there's an origin point here. So if you go to the side view and start rotating, it'll rotate from that point on. And that isn't very useful. So let's go into edit mode, select everything with A. Let's move G and move it to about here and go out of edit mode. That way, when we rotate, it'll rotate from that point on, which is a bit more realistic on an animal. So let's move that back again. About here. So I fixed the origin point for the other objects, so when they rotate correctly. So let's start connecting things. You want to select the last object in the chain, which would be the toes. So you select that, press Shift, click, Control P, which opens this menu, and set parent to objects. So now if you try to rotate this part, the toes will be attached. Let's do the same for this part. So select this, select that, and Control P, set parent to object. So now when we rotate this, there we go. Let's do it for the thigh as well. So select that, select the thigh, Control P, object. So now we have a fully editable leg that is all attached together. So if I rotate the thigh, this is what happens. And rotate this, and then rotate the foot. Perfect. As for the tail, Shift A, add a single bone in armature. Go into edit mode, press Alt C, go to side view, and then let's move this point. So let's move it here. So it starts from here, and let's move that over here maybe. And let's start extruding it. So you just press E and E, and there we go. And I just want to make sure that it's perfectly aligned inside. Perfect. Press the mesh, press the bones. So just like we did previously, you press Ctrl P, and this time you set parent to armature deform with automatic weights. And now when we choose the bones and go into pose mode, let's try rotating. There we go. So you can rotate on the y-axis, the x-axis, the z-axis. So the way I did it was rotate it outwards like this. And obviously if you really rotate it pretty far, you get these deformations, so you can go in and smooth, or you can change the weight paint. But I won't really go into that for now. Last stretch. Since I had most of the body parts separated, I could easily rotate them, change them around, and try to find a pose that would be suitable for Xerocole. We wanted him to come across as a curious little critter, so we tried to find a pose that would communicate that. And as you just saw, I also added in a camera, since for the final render, we'll be seeing him from just one side, so I wanted to make sure everything looked nicely posed for the render. I also started making petal leaves for the flowers on his back using just a plane with a subdivision and solidify modifier. As for the spikes, I used the curve tool add-on, made a nice little pointy curve and copied it around on the back and tail to get that spiky look. Since we'll be seeing him from just the front, I didn't bother adding the spikes everywhere, but I'll do that in the final detailing stage of the mesh. And we're finally at the end. So this is the final presentation for Xerocole. Obviously it doesn't have all the fur and everything now, but all of the fur and details will be added in the next video. Whoa, this was a difficult video to both film and edit. I learned so much throughout this entire process and honestly cannot wait to start sculpting in all of the details in the next part. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!